The central premise of professional wrestling sees athletes competing against one another using their bodies. No guns, no knives, no other weapons besides their own physicality inside the ring and out. Wrestling has broadcast its scope across time, including wrestlers having signature props that they carry to the ring, often known as weapons. Today we're going to be taking a list of the top 10 iconic weapons associated with memorable wrestlers from the last 30 years. No list could be more exhaustive, but these are the examples that stood the test of time in more than one case, influenced the wrestling world beyond the specific character at hand. So I'm MTG from MTG Network, and these are the top 10 wrestlers and their weapons of choice. Subscribe. Number 10, Triple H and his sledgehammer. After he moved up to the main event level in WWE, Triple H got his own signature weapon, the sledgehammer. It's a device that's not only benefiting the gravitas of his more serious persona, but the more benefiting the Attitude Era when the game rose to prominence for being a little over the top, with his potential to truly hurt someone if a non-gimmicked version of the sledgehammer were earnestly used as a weapon. As part of the King of Kings arsenal, the sledgehammer has become something of a super finisher in no-holds-barred scenarios. Wherever the pedigree itself is one of the most over-finishing maneuvers in wrestling, a headshot from a sledgehammer is more decisive, in my opinion. Triple H has used it for such memorable moments such as breaking the sledgehammer over the back of Vince McMahon that essentially ended the DX McMahon rivalry of 2006, besides using the head of a sledgehammer to defeat Sting in a Legends Showdown at WrestleMania 31. And speaking of Sting, number 9, Sting and his baseball bat. The Monday Night War era saw WCW take on a more realistic edge that was in so many ways influential upon the direction WWE and the wrestling business on the whole would take for the years to follow. Chief in WCW's new approach to creative was the New World Order as a rebellious invading heel force with an irresistible edge. Hollywood Hogan stood at the fore of the stable, striking a unique balance between playing a hated heel character within a group that grew quite popular for its cool heel antics. Sting stood up against the group as a lone wolf character to equalize so many situations in which he found himself outnumbered. A baseball bat became the Iconic's weapon of choice. Members of the NWO wielded bats at times too, and so Sting carried one unscored. The shades of gray attached to his character and the early intrigue about whose side he was on, the bat lived on as a signature of Sting's iconic wrestling gimmick. Number 8, John Cena and his chain. Nowadays, John Cena doesn't really have a signature weapon, and he's better known for his squeaky clean, kid-friendly image. However, he was coming up through the ranks in WWE, and after he unblocked his personality via a rapping gimmick, he began frequently using the chain as a weapon. In a particularly memorable spot, he used to knock out The Big Show and beat him for the United States Championship. This was Cena's first main roster title, and nonetheless in Madison Square Garden at WrestleMania 20. While the chain has mostly disappeared from Cena's repertoire in the years to follow, it's noteworthy that it didn't disappear altogether. When Brock Lesnar returned from the UFC in 2012, Cena was the first opponent to fall to the Beast Incarnate's crosshairs. In their Extreme Rules match, Lesnar mostly dominated the action, but Cena ultimately stole the pin after wrapping his trustworthy chain around the fist and later laying out Lesnar. Number 7, Mick Foley and Mr. Socko. While so many wrestlers' signature weapons are blunt objects that are used to knock your opponent, almost rendering him unconscious, it's fitting that Mick Foley would have a quicker weapon of his own that evolved over time in WWE. As Mankind, Foley took on using a unconventional mandible claw as a submission finisher, but as a tradition into a character that was less stark, more comical and childlike, he began using Mr. Socko. The sock puppet was introduced in a vignette during which Foley tried to cheer up Mr. McMahon in the hospital, but soon became a signature part of his act, and putting it on became a peculiar pop for the mandible claw and for the crowd. Mr. Socko stands in stark contrast to Foley's next most famous weapon, Barbie, a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Though he did not bridge the gap between them in one occasion, wrapping Mr. Socko in barbed wire, including this in their match with Edge at WrestleMania 22. Number 6, The Undertaker and his urn. The Undertaker has been on the WWE landscape for so long, it can be easy to forget his compeer elements from his early tenure in the WWE. It is more outlandish, supernatural elements from his gimmick that has defined him as the dead man we know today. After all, his slow walk, the signature casket match, none of that would be normal if brought out in today's day and time, like it was originally portrayed with his character. One piece of the dead man's persona that stuck longer than others was the urn. It was fittingly morbid prop for Paul Bearer to carry around the ring for Undertaker matches and maneuver a weapon that occasionally came into play to incapacitate any of Undertaker's opponents. The urn also took on a more supernatural role as later on down the line, as it controlled the Phenom. As Paul Bearer would control the urn, he would control the dead man in his first run. It would come back around at a deeply more symbolic role as the Undertaker's WrestleMania 29 feud with CM Punk shortly after Paul Bearer had passed away. Number 5, the Big Boss Man and his nightstick. The 1980s and 1990s in the WWE were largely known for its over-the-top occupational gimmicks that implied that wrestlers would have a normal day job that would also shape their identities. The Big Boss Man, a prison guard gimmick, was one of the most successful gimmicks at this time. WWE cashed in on its lucrative factor of a prison guard persona, casting him as a big rival for Hulk Hogan. Later, Big Boss Man was a keen face who gained enough momentum when he took on notorious other cop, Canadian-wise, the Mountie. As both a heel and a face, the nightstick was a logical weapon of choice for the Big Boss Man. As a heel, he used it as a malicious intent to attack faces, and he even transitioned well into the Attitude Era with his character, to add an extra sense of real danger to his character. As a face, the nightstick was an equalizer, used to dole out justify efficiency, and more like just wail on them. Number 4, the Sandman and his Singapore cane. The idea of labeling a weapon as a Singapore cane may not come across as that politically correct or even coherent to a character that has obviously no connection to Singapore. However, in the 1990s, ECW decided to add a little bit of edgy to their product, and why not give a man a Singapore cane to swing around? So it was that the Sandman became synonymous with the cane in wrestling, going so far as to hit himself with it until he was bleeding before he even stepped foot in the ring, working the crowd into a frenzy against the backdrop of Metallica's Enter Sandman. Number 3, the Mountie and his shock stick. While some wrestlers of the 1980s and 1990s became icons based on their cartoonish occupational gimmicks that they made their own, the Mountie was probably one of the victims of the beneficiary of the style of booking as talented. A defiantly strong wrestler became best known for playing a Canadian law enforcement professional, compete with a silly take on the Mountie uniform and his signature shock stick. The shock stick was actually a fairly novel weapon for its time, not just as a blunt weapon to hit someone with, but a more dangerous device that threatened to truly incapacitate its victims, not to mention a blatantly unfair device for a heel to use and to score victories against his face opponents. The Sandman never crossed a short Intercontinental Championship win, though the use of his weapon arguably inspired the use of tasers and part of the wrestling world, particularly in WCW. A kingdom stick becoming the most popular Scott Hall using the cattle rod on Goldberg at Starrcade 98 to help Kevin Nash end the undefeated streak. Number 2, IRS and his briefcase. When WWE wanted to develop a steady mid-card heel character in the early 1990s, Here Comes the Represent the IRS was pretty sure to bet the garner heat from adults who resent having to pay their taxes, and kids who immediately recognized the straight-faced character who wrestled in a shirt and a tie, and someone who was no fun. Mike Rotunda fit the part nicely as a rock-solid, reliable hand in the ring whose charisma and size weren't going to elevate him to the main event level, but who could be trusted to play the part well over the period of years. The briefcase made natural accessory for IRS as he could explain it to contain tax documents, while he can also wielding it as an unlikely blunt object. The briefcase served him well throughout his singles work, and a nice addition to help his Money Inc. tag team with Ted DiBiase to victory. Number 1, Hacksaw Jim Duggan and his 2x4. Most of the weapons discussed on this list can be rapidly identified as a heel character who would use them to cheat to win. The 2x4 board that Hacksaw Jim Duggan would carry to the ring is a prime example of how a Face 2 could benefit from a destructive prop, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. Duggan's 2x4 was one of the most recognizable pieces of his act, On the national stage, Duggan was almost exclusively a face character and used the board to fend off heels when they would outnumber the good guys. The 2x4 was pretty much uniquely connected to Duggan's persona, though WWE did do a brief change of the device when the members of the Union briefly took them on their Attitude Era war against Shane McMahon and the company. And that's our list. Did we miss any out? Please let them know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'm MTG from MTG Network. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll see y'all later.